What's going on? Welcome back to Catching Carbon, episode 2. Jeff Holyoak, Luke Lana, and we are going to dive in today to why am I experiencing shortages of CO2? That's the big question right now. People are trying to understand, and we want to kind of lay out the explanation. To really understand that question at its core, we need to know, where does our CO2 come from here in the United States, and break down why have we not been proactively capturing CO2 from additional sources. And so we want to get straight into that. What makes us different from other parts of the world? Why has this not been an issue? Why is it now an issue? And why do we see it perpetuating into the future?
Yeah, you nailed it. Hit it right on the head there. That is the underlying theme of all of this. Is here in the U.S. we have had an abundant supply of CO2, or sources of CO2 that come out very clean, so therefore it's cheap. So CO2 is a very abundant, cheap gas up until about now. So let's talk about that. There's 4 major sources of CO2 in this country, and this chair is extremely squeaky, so I apologize.
You got to sit still. You got the nervous tick. Yeah, he's camera shy. Give him a break. Now he's grooving on camera.
Yeah, agree. Anyway, 4 sources of CO2 in this country. First being ammonia production. That's a high user of burns natural gas to produce the ammonia and the nitrates. But you get an abundant amount of very clean CO2 that comes out of that. That makes up roughly 25% of our CO2 supply in this country. Ethanol production, corn belt, Midwest. We have produced, we are the bread basket of the world. We have an abundant amount of grain, an abundant amount of corn production here in this country, abundant amount of ethanol that we mix in with our fuels and our gasoline. So that makes up about another 25%. Another 25%, we have 2 very large geological domes in the southwest and the southeast. Those geological domes are filled with abundant supply of very clean, pure CO2, and we've been pulling off those domes for decades now. And the other 25, that's about another 25%, and the last 25% is alternative sources, synthetic gases, syngas, biogas, coming off of landfills, cow manure, other sources like that. So that's another 25%. So as I noted there, most of that, 75% of our CO2 is already very clean. So very limited upfront purification. So as it's coming out, it's roughly 98% CO2. Whereas if you're pulling off of, say, natural gas burning or in SMR and hydrogen production, things like that, you have a 10 to 12% purity level of that CO2. So you have a lot more cleaning that has to go on. The rest of the world's having to experience that. We don't. We have very cheap CO2.
Right, and a lot of your operating expenses in the energy it takes to clean CO2 from a less pure composition to that, what we call industrial food beverage grade. And so when you're at 98% and you need to get to 99.9, it doesn't take all that much past liquefaction, turning the vapor into a liquid. But when you're at 10%, when you're at 0.2, 0.4% in direct air capture, very energy intensive process, and as a result, you have CO2 that's not competitive with market pricing. And so that's why traditionally we've really focused on the 4 big sources. But Jeff, why don't you unpack for us why we see these sources kind of tightening up? Each one kind of has its own contribution, and it feels like the perfect storm right now where We're starting to feel restriction throughout all of these sources.
Nope, absolutely dead on. It's we just say, we get all this cheap CO2, then why are you out? That's a great question. Why am I getting a force majeure every other day? Why is my price being escalated in multiples of X of 3, 4, or 5 times? And the reason being is, like you said, it is a little bit of that perfect storm. So go back to ammonia production. Every year, ammonia plants shut down after the harvest at this time of year, end of summer. And when natural gas prices are high or demand for CO2 is low, they generally shut down for longer than 2 weeks for these plant shutdowns and preventive maintenance. So natural gas is one of the largest components of production of ammonia, therefore the largest cost. We all know what the natural gas prices are doing. We'll touch here a little bit in future episodes on how the European, the Russian impact of that natural gas are exporting that. Natural gas prices are very high and they're here to stay for a long time. So those shutdowns on our ammonia plants, very impactful. Ethanol, especially during the COVID in the last 2 years, what didn't we do in the early stages of COVID? We didn't drive, we didn't fly, we didn't do a lot of things. We actually, at some point in 2020, late 2020, early 2021, I believe, had the largest surplus supply of ethanol in storage in history.
Yeah, and actually, I just saw a statistic that we are kind of back to those levels in terms of usage, driving. Right now with the inflationary environment, people are staying home. We did just see that come out very equal to peak COVID, which is, I mean, it's crazy to think about.
So we're starting to get there. That supply is coming back, but it's still, again, we had a whole, rat and the snake glut supply of it to get through, and they're back to general production. But electric vehicles, hydrogen, any kind of EV. It's going to impact the demand on ethanol long term, and so between the U.S. and Brazil, I think the number is somewhere like 80% of the world's supply of ethanol comes from that. And then the geological domes, that's the third major impact in this perfect storm. So we've been pulling off these domes, as we noted, for decades, but there's multiple wells. I think the number is somewhere like 5,000 individual wells that make up what we call these domes. And as one gets low, we got to convert over to another one. And where they're pulling off of now, the purity level is much lower. So not only is the purity level lower, so a plant that's doing 800 tons per day is now producing 600 tons per day. So we've lost 25% of the volume off that plant. And the reason being is because it's clogging the filtration systems. It's taking longer to produce. And on top of that, it still isn't, we're not set up to purify some of the benzenes and oxygen levels and things like that off of these domes. So the capacity has been constrained off of pre-existing dome supply. On top of that, we'll talk about this in another episode, but
I know
contamination, purity levels, if you have filtration and you went from changing your filters out every 6 months to every 3 weeks, again, as we talked about early in the first episode, it is an ingredient, and we're getting contaminated CO2 throughout the supply chain right now.
Yeah, and just take a minute at home to think that through. We're talking about pulling out of naturally occurring domes, while legislation is pushing to sequester CO2. So we're putting it into the ground and we're pulling it right back out. How long is that really going to last? So not only is there a lack of purity, but how long until we say these domes are closed up? I mean, this is going exactly against everything that we're pushing for sequestration.
We're not putting it into the ground. We're paying people to put it into the ground.
There we go.
Paying it, and then we pull it back out. And nothing against the domes. It's been a great supply for us for a long time. But as you just said, as we're pulling it off, and we'll talk about 45Q in much greater detail in upcoming episodes, because that's going to impact you. So let's talk about this. So this is great. Now you know why you're short. Well, that's not the whole point of this podcast and what we're here to talk about. Ultimately, it's like, how does that help me? Right? What all you just told me is I'm screwed, and I'm going to remain to be screwed.
Doom and gloom. We're just coming at you with the doom and gloom.
Yeah. And we're here to tell you for the next 3 months, we're all kind of screwed. And hey, we're in the manufacturing business ourselves, and we are on a 0% allocation of CO2. We're all living hand to mouth of these supplies. So how does that help me? What are you guys doing about it? And so what's the name of our podcast?
Catching carbon.
Catching carbon.
We're catching carbon.
So there is alternative sources. They are a little bit more expensive, but there's alternative sources of supply, and we already talked about that syngas, the biogas, whether it's capturing off of landfills, capturing off of cow manure, things of that nature. There are other green initiatives that ultimately will capture CO2, take that out, because we all are very fearful that the grand supply of CO2 off of those other sources that we talked about are going to go away, not today, not tomorrow, but in the next 5 to 10 years.
Right.
There's all sorts of technology and development in ammonia production for much greener production of ammonia, as well as the grand reduction of ammonia. Go look at the Netherlands, which is a large producer of ammonia. They're trying to eliminate the use of ammonia for a fertilizer altogether.
Yeah.
So, things like that, you're going to see a grand shift. Continue to stay tuned to our future conversations of how do we help you.
And with the shift, Jeff alluded to this in the pilot episode, but there will be what we anticipate being a permanent shift in pricing. And so, as noted, it takes more energy. There's higher expenses to produce that pure CO2. We do believe that CO2 is not going to be that down and dirty cheap gas historically it has been. We see it in Europe. We can touch on Europe a little bit. We're going to see it here. But the good news is we come out of the storm with abundance of supply. And that's what it's all about right now, is how do we get the CO2 to accomplish what for us, the manufacturing piece, for our food and beverage, carbonation, freezing a product. I mean, we have to have CO2. And so we may not see CO2 at the prices we have historically, but we certainly can make sure that we're supplying CO2.
Yeah, so the last topic I think we'll cover is, what I like to say is, this isn't new. This isn't new technology. Capturing off of natural gas, capturing off of landfills, capturing off of methane production, none of that is new. We don't talk about it here in the U.S. We don't even really have an infrastructure for it. We're helping build that infrastructure.
Yeah, it feels taboo right now.
It does, but because we had a cheap supply of CO2.
Right.
Europe does not. They don't have ethanol. They have outlawed and banned a lot of the ammonia production in itself. Like I said, the Netherlands is a large producer of that, but the rest of Europe doesn't do that. And they also have huge carbon taxes and carbon trade and limitations that we just don't have here in the U.S. So even when you are producing those things, it's a negative connotation. You're being penalized to do it, understandably. So the technology exists to capture off of all these other sources, and we're working to identify the most voluminous and cost-effective way to do that. And we believe natural gas burners is an absolute first step on that. Natural gas burning, if you have a boiler and you're burning natural gas, you can capture that CO2. If you actually use CO2 and you burn natural gas, that's the grand flush right there.
For every 1 million BTUs burned, you're producing about 117 pounds of CO2. You can go home and fact check me, but that is the statistic. And so
I can't do that math.
Yeah,
it sounds like a lot.
I'm a math whiz. That's my thing with the numbers guy.
Outstanding.
No, so but it's crazy. I mean, there's an abundance of CO2 being produced, and we see that as the first opportunity to go and start creating self-sufficiency on your own CO2 supply.
Absolutely. So we call it security of supply. And as we noted early on, and we'll talk about all the time in this episodes, in this podcast, is we are not focused on the pathway to green, and then net zero, but think about that. We're capturing all these other CO2 sources, and those are the large, abundant producers of CO2, ethanols and methanes, and power generation, and even hydrogen production through SMR produces a tremendous amount of of CO2, and that is going to get sequestered under 45Q. So that's being taken out of the environment. So now we actually do have a green initiative of capturing all the other sources and then reusing that in our current retail supply.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It absolutely
so
is.
we can sit here and absolutely say we have to make the business case, and that's what we're going to do. But the byproduct of that is decarbonization. Exciting for us to be a part of, but also we're focused on making your business operate and function. It's got a pencil. We've got to be in the black before we're in the green. We said it in the pilot episode. We'll say.
Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, the economics of CO2 has changed dramatically and will continue to change. So as we've been saying, we're accustomed to low-cost, cheap CO2 in this country. Now we're going to progress to a little bit more expensive. However, what's more important? Saving a penny per pound, paying 5.5 cents instead of 6.5 cents, that's not your ROI. The economics has absolutely changed. If your plant is shut down for one shift, 1 day, 5 days, what's the absolute cost of that? So it's no longer the cost of the CO2 that you should be doing your ROI assessment on. It is the operational cost, the opportunity cost of not having that. So as we've been talking about, it's all about the security of supply. We will continue to expand and explore opportunities to do that for your business and for your operations.
Yeah, really excited about that. We're going to keep bringing you content, help you understand and educate. Where do I navigate? Where do I go? What is my opportunity to weather the storm? And we're going to dive deeper in episode 3. So thank you guys so much for coming. We'll see you then. Until next time, catching carbon.